For tonight, like I mentioned, we are going to be talking about Abraham. And after I chose Abraham, full transparency, I kind of regretted it because I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much on Abraham. You know, you got like 6, 7 chapters, however many it ends up being, just talking about this guy's life, how he's such a central figure in modeling faith and modeling, being justified through his faith, and his faith counted as righteousness, the same way we put our faith in Jesus, it's counted as our righteousness. So you have like this model of a man that directly reflects Old Testament to New Testament. And how do you capture all of that, related to our lives today in 30 minutes? And I was like, maybe I made a bad decision. But I had already told Amanda, I committed. All the other teachers knew what people were available. So I couldn't just decide last minute to pick somebody else. So we're going to talk about Abraham. And my goal tonight is not necessarily to go through like a biography of his life. More so just some of the characteristics, I believe that he displayed, how those relate to us a little bit. And then we'll have some table time to talk about, how maybe we could do some of those things, or where we at in our life in relation to how Abraham operated. Because I know he definitely had a certain level of faith and obedience, humility, hospitality, resilience, perseverance. When I was thinking of what to title the message, I was like, he's the patient, persistent, powerful pilgrim, because he was kind of a nomad. But anyways, so like if we look at Abraham's life, and this is just a kind of a short like synopsis of his life, and I like kind of the beginning of it. Jesus says God says you're gonna go, doesn't tell him where he's gonna go, and he goes. And for those who are real familiar, he actually goes the wrong direction, spends 5 years in, where he shouldn't have been. If you're real familiar, he should have gone, I believe, southwest, and he went kind of north. That may be incorrect, but if I remember right, as I was studying. So you have this guy, like the beginning of his story and his life, as you see, is like he's commanded to go somewhere, and it's like this instantaneous, yes, I'm going to go. And we don't necessarily know all of the backstory of Abraham from being a child to this point in his life. You do know from other books that like his father, it says his father served many gods. So you're not for certain, did Abraham grow up serving some of those gods? Was he a pagan? Most likely probably was. And then God comes to him, calls him, illuminates his life, and directs him to go somewhere. And I love that he has this blind faith where he just stands up and he goes. And he goes multiple different places, multiple different times. And as you're kind of observing the pattern of his life, to me, since it's supposed to relate and reflect, because it says here, God promises Abraham that his offspring is going to be the seed. And as you know, it goes to Isaac, and then it's, Jacob. And then from there you get to David. From David, you get all the way to Jesus. But the cool part to me is that when I look at Abraham's life and I start from the beginning and I see that he's commanded to do something and he goes and does it, I just like that there was action and it's tangible. And if I'm supposed to look at my life and relate it to Abraham in any capacity, knowing the purpose that he served, is our faith that contain that type of action? Because it may be very easy to say that I believe, because it says Abraham's believed and it was counted to him as righteousness, right? It's mentioned in Genesis, it's mentioned in Hebrews, it's mentioned in James. James mentions it like when it's talking about faith without works is dead, and it says Abraham's works justified him. So it wasn't the means by which he was saved, but it was a byproduct of his belief in God. And I think that's a great example to look at how Abraham lived this life, and in every situation, he had an unwavering faith, and he's directed on where to go, what to do, and how to do it. And something that I really enjoyed about Abraham is that for those who've been kind of trekking through the whole Old Testament leaders, I did a class last session over Daniel, And sometimes I look at Daniel and I kind of feel bad about myself in a way, because this guy was a young boy who demonstrated such courage, who you don't really see, like, maybe where he struggled, where he sinned, where he fell short. And that's at times kind of, like, whoa, I can't ever measure up to this level of life that Daniel lived. But you look at like David, okay, David made a bunch of mistakes. You look at other people in the Bible, and when you look at Abraham, what I love about him is that, and this is why I feel bad about the class tonight, guys, and I'm so sorry for those of you who are like, I don't even know who Abraham is. I've never heard of him. I'm kind of speaking as if you have some knowledge of him in some capacity, but he lied about his wife, right? So he lied and said that his wife was his sister, so he didn't get persecuted. And then he doubled down on it again and said he lied again and said, no, it's my father's daughter, not my mother's daughter. So you have a guy who you're looking at as the father of faith, where Jesus and God, where they birth, the history of how we were going to come to know and stand righteous in front of our Father and inherit eternity. And it's a guy who told some lies, like there's a certain level of relatability to looking at Abraham's life when you see that he made mistakes, that even as you pattern your life after him and say, wow, here's a guy that when God said go, he went, even if he didn't know where he was supposed to go, how he's supposed to get there, what it would cost him. Even when it came to, splitting up land between him and Lot, he didn't bicker over it. He gave Lot the choice, even though he was the older one and should have got the inheritance. And then Lot ends up, cascading into chaos because he's in Sodom and Gomorrah. But you have this guy who followed, but he still made mistakes. And not only did he follow the pattern that God had for his life and his commandments, and he then later on, he's given a promise of God that he's going to bear a son, right, with his wife Sarah, who's 90, he's 99. But previous to that, he ends up having Ishmael. And you're thinking, here's this guy who did not wait for the promise of God and put the promise of God in his own hands, in his wife's hands, and has an affair with his wife's handmaiden, or I don't know if that's the proper term to use, like servant. And still, God chose to use him. Still, God had a plan for his life. Still, God does so much through the lineage of Jesus all the way down to us today through this man who was flawed but had faith. So that tells me that my faith is not always going to come without flaws, right? Like my faith is not always going to come without a problem. It's not always going to come without a mistake. But the heart of the faith was believe, action, believe, action, believe, action. And I love that about Abraham and his life, because it demonstrates such a commitment to the God that you claim to love. So even to the point where he's asked to sacrifice his own son, and he takes him to the altar and he's ready to sacrifice Isaac, the promised son, the promised seed, the promised lineage of Christ, the promise of this kingdom to come. And he's going to go through with it. And it's like, here's this guy who is committed to what God has commanded him to do, sight unseen, promises not fulfilled. I mean, the guy's moving around everywhere because God promised that he was going to have a land for people. And, maybe he didn't understand at that time that was a land to come far, far, far down the road, after Jesus and after, Christ comes back and returns. But this guy that seemed to be so ordinary had a purpose on his life. And I love how it matches up to mine in your life, where we're just going about our business and the Holy Spirit draws us near and gives us a direction through the gospel of Jesus. And we have to act on that. And we can't just simply say that our faith and our belief just stays as a thought in our mind, but as an action that leads to tangible things down the road based off the promises that God has that many of us are not going to see in this lifetime, right? Some of this, we've been saved, but, we're not fully glorified until Christ returns again. And through that process, there's a lot of flesh inside of us. There's a lot of sin inside of us. There's a lot of areas of opportunity to grow. But just when I look at Abraham, I'm kind of comforted to know that a man that was used for so much also made mistakes. He also had some issues along the journey. He wasn't always doing what he should have done, but he demonstrated characteristics of perseverance, of patience, and there was power in those things. He believed in a promise. And so no matter where we're at today, I think that there's many situations where we all have some area of our life where we need to be a little bit more patient. We need to be a little bit more trusting. We need to be a little bit more understanding that God, even if we don't have a plan, and how do I model my life after Abraham? Because that's how I personally like to look at these Old Testament leaders. I told Bianca today, I don't know if I would quote unquote call them Old Testament leaders as much as I maybe would call them like men and women of God or heroes of the faith. But when I see these guys, it's like they all had a certain demeanor of obedience, of faith, obedience, of faith, obedience, faith. They took action, they took action, they took action, they followed, they followed, they followed. And if we go back to kind of square one, not including Adam and Eve, but really Abraham, who kind of started this, justified through faith, in God, what was the pattern of his life, and why should my life be any different? If this man demonstrated a certain level of perseverance and unwavering faith, if he had a certain level of obedience to what God called him to do we model our life after that in the same pattern as he did? I think that's important to kind of run that through your head and determine, like, do I believe in God enough to obey him? And Abraham was tested, and he demonstrated with his son Isaac laying on a rock and an altar that he believed and trusted God enough that no matter the calling, no matter the hardship, no matter the struggle, no matter the pain, that he was willing to serve his Lord no matter the cost. And I want to model my life after that man, because in him is the promise of Jesus. In him is the promise of being saved by grace through our faith. But that faith does not come without works. And the craziest part is that so many, like when you look at this story of Abraham, the negative side of it, and I think that's the important side to acknowledge as well for us in here today, is that when he put life into his own hands, worked at his own pace, didn't trust God, didn't remain patient, he had another son, Ishmael. And for those who are not familiar, Ishmael is the lineage of Muhammad, the lineage of Muslims. And look at all the chaos, all the suffering, all the friction, all the war that has come because someone didn't do what God told them to do at the time that God told them to do it, and didn't continue to remain trusting him. That he's part of that, right? He's part of that same exact situation, the same way that Saul is responsible for everything that almost happened to Esther when the whole kingdom almost got annihilated for all the Jews, because he didn't follow God's commandment and kill all the people he's supposed to kill. So it's like, even in the midst of a guy who's doing so well, who's doing so good, who's making good choices, he also demonstrates to us that when we don't trust in God's timing, when we don't follow God's plan, when we don't follow God's path for our life, that a lot of heartache and hardship and division can come. And not just for my life then and there, but for generations and generations and generations to come, for a long, long time. And then there's the point of contention of, this is also, in a sense, the birth of Judaism. And they look at this as the faith that he had was his works. And so it's kind of like they're going to see it as, here's Abraham, and all these works that he did, they made him better than everybody else. And that's why he was righteous, because he did all this works, all this works, all this works. And because he did all these works, he was a righteous man. But then you look at the sinful side of his life and say, well, no, this guy lied. Like, that's not righteous. He had another wife when he already had one wife, to have a kid that wasn't the promised kid, that led to division. Like, how could you then say that he's the man of righteousness and that he earned his salvation through righteousness? Like, he didn't earn his salvation through righteousness. He earned it through his faith that led to his works. So the number one thing was, he was first faithful, then the works followed, right? He was faithful, so then he walked Isaac up to the top of the mountain. He was faithful, so then he went to Canaan. He was faithful, and so then he did these different things throughout his life and trusted God's plan, trusted God's purpose for his life. And that's it's a lot easier said than done. It's not always as simplistic as we would like it to be. And I really wish to go through like a 6-week class on Abraham's life and take it verse by verse, chapter by chapter to really demonstrate and understand who he was, what he did, how he lived. But the main thing that I wanted everybody to understand is like when you look at his life, here's a man who acted upon the word of God, no questions asked, time and time again, and he didn't let his mistakes define who he was. He didn't let his past define who he was. He remained faithful, and to the point where he's called a friend of God. And I think there's some truth to all these people in the Bible, whether it's Abraham or whether it's David, who they say was a man after God's own heart, is that these guys were not without their flaw, but their aim was to please God. And is our life reflective of that? And I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and me and him were talking about sanctification and righteousness and the pursuit of sanctification, the pursuit of righteousness and being holy and removing sin from your life. And I was like, I agree with all of that because that's a part of who we are and what we should do and what should be a byproduct of the Holy Spirit transforming our hearts. But at the root of it all, do we have a heart to pursue God and to pursue who he is and to continue to get closer to him, continue to follow who he is, and then allow that working of God to demonstrate itself through our sanctification? It's like, in a sense, like we're not pursuing the byproduct, we're pursuing the source. And if I could pursue the source, what does that say about me? Because when I look at David being a man for God's own heart, and I look at Abraham being considered a friend of God, the one thing I see in both of them is they were just pursuing, honoring God through the commandments that he gave them, and then all the other chips fell in place. Now, there was some problems along the way. There was a lot of mistakes made. If they could, they'd probably go back and change some stuff. But it's just, I'm a lifelong skeptic, right? And I get very skeptical at times about the Bible, but that led me to studying the Bible and for tons and tons of time because I want to know more. And when I see these guys in the Old Testament, it really, even the New Testament, it gives me a certain sense of encouragement. And that's why I'm such a big believer in being part of a community and being at church and discipling, because you can see that they went through certain situations similar to what we're going through, and God still had his hand on their life, still directed their path, still provided them the source they needed to be sustained. And so that's kind of, as we move into some time to just sit at our tables and talk a little bit is there an area of your life where maybe you're not being as patient as you could be? And remember, patience is a fruit of the Spirit. Like you're not being as patient as you could be in becoming who God has called you to become. Or maybe there's a certain level of persistence that's necessary. And are you being persistent in your pursuit of knowing God more? Or has maybe life kind of knocked you down a little bit and you're not continuing in the path closer to him because you're discouraged that maybe growth hasn't taken place as fast as you would desire it to take place? Or is there other areas where you could see a promise in the Bible and that promise is not reflected in your everyday life? And how do those things make you feel? How do you process that information? I love Wednesday nights and men's group and stuff probably more than I do Sunday services because it gives us all the opportunity to converse, to talk, to get some thoughts in our heart out, to bear each other's burdens, and to really try to hopefully look at the life of someone in the Bible who I really believe are meant to be there as examples, as encouragers, and see where in my life do I miss the mark and what are some things that those individuals did that maybe I'm not doing. Maybe there's an area of my life that's not what it's supposed to be, and I know in my heart God's commanded me to do a certain thing, but I'm not willing to take that step, right? And one time, I think it was Bianca and me were talking, and I said, sometimes it's hard to like trust in God because you don't know exactly where you're going, but you do in your heart know the direction you're supposed to go. So it was like if someone said, I want you to meet me in Dallas to eat some dinner tonight, meet me in 30 minutes, and they call you in 30 minutes or 20 minutes, like, hey, man, so we're going to meet here, here, and here. Oh, I'll be there in 45. I haven't left my house yet. It's like just because you don't know exactly where you're supposed to go doesn't mean you can't start moving in the right direction. And I think Abraham was a great example of that. He did not know where exactly God was calling him, where this promised land was going to be, what it was going to look like, who was going to be there, what the path of his life and God blessing him and God doing these things for him, what that meant. But nonetheless, he started on the journey. He packed his bags and he went. He didn't know what it was going to look like when he got to that altar and he had to lay his son there and sacrifice him potentially. But he went and he pursued. And so I hope we could do those same things as well. To be a to be a good example of a transformative life, to be there for our friends and our family, to continue to honor and love God, and I apologize to all of you who maybe have not studied Abraham in his life. It's a great read, Genesis 12 through 17. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's encouraging. I remember I one time was talking to Pastor Steve, who those are familiar with Pastor Steve at the Grace Place, New York. And I told him, man, I've made a lot of mistakes, Steve. I just don't feel like I'm worthy to serve God or to serve people in a church. And he's like, have you ever killed a Christian? I'm like, no. He's like, Paul has. And he wrote a lot of books in the Bible. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what to do with that. This is weird. But no, I haven't. All right. But no, that's so true. And I think that's on purpose. Because we are imperfect, we are fallen, we are, fleshly individuals who, as the Bible say, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And to see that there's people who were just like us, used in such a powerful way, but also grown and developed and transformed for God and for his glory is very, very encouraging. So yeah, we'll spend a couple minutes at our tables. And the main premise, because I didn't actually write anything down. Like I didn't have no questions. I don't know. I'm so sorry. I need to do better next time. I should have had some questions. I'm not a big question guy. Like I only usually do them because my sister tells me I need to do them. And I didn't do them this week. And she's like, "What, do you have any questions?" I'm like, "I don't." I was like, I have like 10 pages of notes from Abraham. I don't even know how I'm going to put it all together and try to tell this guy's story. Aside from just be obedient. So the main thing to talk about is, are you faithfully obeying God in the commandments that he's given us in life? Are you being patient? Are you being persistent? Are you persevering? Are you trusting in who God is and the plan that he has for your life? And are you pursuing, even though this is not directly related to Abraham, like the question like I think of when I think of Abraham is, am I pursuing closeness to God? Like, am I pursuing that my life revolves around him, his purpose, and his plan, and always knowing that when I don't follow that plan, what can come from it? And how could that impact other people? Because Abraham's dead, right? And so his actions that led to Ishmael, that led to Muhammad, he's not experiencing that right now. But people all around the world are experiencing persecution because of that. So just to keep that in our mind, like how so much good can come when I'm obedient and faithful to God and I follow the path that he has for my life and his commandments and his word, and then how much adversity and struggle and chaos can come when I don't, and how it can not even involve me. It can involve people that I come in contact with every single day. It can involve my family, my friends, and people that I may have never even met that somebody else will impact because of my negative impact to them. And like, I don't want to be a part of that. So I'll stop talking now so you guys can spend a couple minutes at your tables together. Talk about whatever's on your heart. How about that? Sound good? And I'll be back here in a few minutes.